All right, welcome everyone. I am going to actually jump right in because we've only got 45 minutes together, but I'm so glad you're here, and I'm sure folks will keep trickling in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second episode of Data Talks, a series of free 45-minute webinars using local data to inform housing policy. I'm Claudia Aiken. I'm our Director of New Research Partnerships here at the Housing Solutions Lab. I'm joined today by Professor Ingrid Gold-Ellen, one of our faculty directors, who will be speaking with us about using local data to learn about rental properties. And I'm also delighted to welcome our guest, Allison Pretto. Allison is a project manager at the City of Oakland, California, and has been leading the city's launch of a rental registry there, and we can't wait to ask her all about it. I'll start things off, though, with just a very brief introduction to the Housing Solutions Lab and to this series. Ingrid will then lead us in a short presentation about local data sources and rental registries that can help us understand property ownership, conditions, and costs. Then we'll have a conversation with Allison about Oakland's registry, what sorts of information it will contain, and how the city hopes to put that information to use. And finally, we will have about 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to submit those via the Q&A chat function at any time during the session, and we will get to as many of those as we can. We will also be sharing a recording of this session that we will post on our website as well as send out in our newsletter. I will drop a link in the chat shortly to the page where we usually post those. All right, so if you're not familiar with the lab, we are based at the NYU Furman Center, and our mission is to help small and mid-sized cities plan, launch, and evaluate housing policies with the goal of advancing racial equity and health and well-being. Through our direct work with cities all over the country, one of the things we've heard many, many times is that there is just a need to better understand your local rental stock and to track rents and understand trends in ownership. So today is an exploration of how local data sources can help us do that. I hope you will also join us for upcoming episodes, including one in March on surveying residents about housing needs, another in June on housing conditions data, and one planned for August on data storytelling. Each of these sessions will feature a fireside chat with someone like Allison who has direct experience on the ground, and we will update everyone here when registration for a new episode is live. So now, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Ingrid.
Great, and I'm going to jump right in also, not to waste any time, and so we can get as much time as possible with Allison. We just thought it would be useful to give just a really quick overview. This slide may be kind of obvious, but there are lots of reasons that city officials need information about rents, rental properties, rental ownership. Partially, in part, it's to enforce housing quality standards, to enforce tenant protections and rent regulations, to monitor trends in rents, to design and target programs for property repairs, for landlords, for tenant-focused programs, for rental assistance, eviction prevention. And unfortunately, there are very few sort of national data sets that have very sort of geographically specific and timely information about rent and rental properties. And so, and that's not to say, Claudia, if you can go to the next slide, that's not to say that localities have no information at all about rental properties, right? They're basically in pretty much every locality. Sometimes at the county level, you have there exists deeds data and property tax assessment data. And so if you can go to the next slide, deeds data, I think many of you probably know, these are basically records of sale. So they record information at the time of a property sale, and they include the names of the buyer and the sellers, the date that the sale transacts, and the purchase price. In addition, you would have access to usually annual, sometimes semi-annual property assessment data that the property data that's used for the purposes of tax assessment, that includes information about assessed value, number of units, the last sales date and price, and the name of the of the owner. But the shortcomings of these data, if you can go to the next slide, is that often, first of all, some of these also, it's not easy to just identify which properties are rental from these sources, and especially sort of smaller buildings, which often transition from rental to ownership. In addition to, it's difficult to identify the owners in many cases who ultimately owns the properties, because corporate owners often use these sort of LLCs that make it very difficult to sort of pierce the veil to figure out who actually owns which properties. The deeds and tax assessment data don't include critical information. Again, they don't generally identify whether it's a rental property or not, but they don't include data about current rents, other characteristics of the properties. And finally, these administrative data sets may be difficult to access. They may not be that sort of public, may not be publicly accessible, but even for city officials, they may be in a sort of difficult to use format. So in response to this, if you can go to the next slide, right, a number of localities have created rental registries that basically record ownership and information about the rental stock. And particularly registries often require rental properties owners to provide information to the city, their individual name, not an LLC, but in contact information, the number of units in the building, often the number of bedrooms in those units, the bedroom mix, the rent levels, occupancy statistics, other property characteristics like number of parking spaces in the building, and then often sometimes these registries are known to sort of rental licensing programs, because in many cities basically this is sort of they're part of a requirement to submit this information to get a license to operate rental property. And there are, if you can go to the next slide, that there are lots of benefits to these registries, right? One is that these registries can be incredibly helpful in just in enforcing housing quality standards, right? And code enforcement. I mean, they can be, you can think about this, right? If you find a property that has a ton of egregious code violations, one of the things you might want to do is go out and proactively inspect the other properties that are owned by the same owner, right? And just generally, knowing who the owners are is critical to be able to get in to inspect. And so it's really the basis for sort of proactive inspections, which can be more effective than just complaint-based programs. It can be more effective and they can be more fair. Secondly, in cities with rent regulation ordinances, the rent registries can really help in enforcing those rent regulations and ensuring that owners are not charging more than they're legally allowed to do so. They more generally, just incredibly helpful for sort of data collection more broadly. They, track information about rental ownerships, allows cities to target, let's say, policies to small landlords, right? To deliver rental assistance. I mean, one of the things that many cities were plagued with, which Claudia and I have worked on before in delivering the federal emergency rental assistance program that was implemented at the start of the Biden administration. And a lot of cities really were slow in delivering that rental assistance during the early part of the pandemic because they couldn't identify the owners. They didn't know who owned the buildings. And finally, registries, right? There's lots of talk, lots of concern these days about sort of investor ownership of properties. And so this would allow cities to sort of track investor ownership and compare outcomes and actually see how the outcomes of those buildings differ from those of other landlords. And so there are, if you can go to the next slide, I recently wrote a paper with Lori Goodman from the Urban Institute about single family rentals, which represent about just over a third of rental properties in the US. They can be particularly difficult to identify as rentals. And there's growing concern again about these rentals. I mean, the truth is, like, the share of property rental properties that are single family rentals hasn't increased that much. I mean, it's not that up that much from where it was in the early 90s, but there's growing concern that those are owned by institutional investors. And so what we called for in this paper was basically greater transparency about property ownership through more widespread adoption of registries. And in particular, we called for, the federal government to develop a model registry, and that's something I'd love to, maybe we can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A and what the value of that would be. But if you can go on to the next slide. There certainly are some potential downsides to these registries. There's affordability concerns that landlords, these registries generally charge some fees, and that landlords will pass those on, but to tenants, but or ultimately just sort of discourage the creation of rental housing. And altogether, and cities can sort of limit these concerns by reducing the registration fees, providing, particularly providing financial incentives or, assistance or incentives to lower income landlords, to encourage them and to make it easier for them to participate. They can take a more kind of, think about this less as sort of punitive, but a more cooperative approach that the city is really working with owners. There are many well-intentioned owners who really struggle with maintaining quality. And you could sort of limit the pass-through to the tenants when there's rent stabilization. So you can go to the next slide. So recently, our team did a scan of rental registries across the United States, and sort of studied about 40, I think 46 of, right? It's 46 of these rental registry ordinances around the country. We will publish that soon. I'm sure we will let you know, Claudia. We will let everybody know when that's published in the next couple of weeks. But we learned a lot from doing this. And if you can go to the next slide. I think that first of all, it's sort of interesting just to see kind of what the purposes were, and what the goals were. It's something we'll want to ask Allison, right? The most commonly stated, which was surprising to me, purpose for these registries was actually sort of, enforcing sort of the housing codes and ensuring housing quality and safety. Some were designed to enforce rent control laws. That's really, for instance, mostly in California. Some were cited contacting landlords as the key reason, and a small number were also stated that they were created that, primarily to protect tenants and track evictions in particular. So and the next slide. So, we also learned a lot about sort of the key, we looked at sort of the key features of these registries. And if you can go to the next slide, one thing, it turns out that sort of coverage varies, but, most registries required at least all non-owner occupied rental properties to be registered. So basically all properties that sort of had well, that weren't owner occupied and rental, let me say that. And some of them only applied to rent stabilized units. A few were mandatory only for multifamily properties, sort of above, the definitions varied, but sort of above 4 or 5 units or more. It's interesting, right, that cities have to think about sort of what's the right balance between, you want to collect a lot of information. I mean, as a researcher, like, I want to collect as much information as possible, but I don't want to make this, I want to also be careful not to make this too burdensome either on owners or on city officials. We found that sort of all registries collected some kind of contact information about owners. Many required owners to provide a name and address of an individual, and sort of to get under the LLC to sort of identify sort of a real person, and to collect some information about the property managers as well. Many collected information about the property characteristics, the number of units, the size of those units, number of parking spaces. Some collected also information about current rents, and a few asked about occupancy, which was surprising to us, and lease start and end dates. Um, and so if you can go to the next slide, I mean, one question is sort of how often owners have to submit this information. Most of these required owners to register annually or at least every few years. About half of them charge sort of a per unit fee, usually between like $15 and $50. And then there were fines if owners didn't comply, right? And that ranged from $25 per day to sort of $500 per day in Seattle. And now, even despite those fines, Claudia, if you can go to the next slide, right? Enforcement is often a challenge with these. So it's like sometimes there's some places it's like you can't just think about designing these. You also need to think about, okay, what's workable? What can we actually enforce? And Elijah LaCampa and Vincent Reyna did an interesting study of 10 cities, sort of a survey, and found that compliance varied widely, right? From 10% in Indianapolis to over 70% in Trenton. And compliance requires it requires staff time and costs, and cities are going to have to think about how to make these trade-offs, right? It's sort of in terms of measuring costs against the benefits of having as much information as possible. So you might limit who has to register and which properties have to register which owners and how often. And so, I think that in addition to sort of the sticks of having these fines, cities can also think about what kind of set of carrots that they could offer to places to encourage compliance, right? So they might require, in New York City, that you can't file an eviction unless you're actually registered with the city, right? It could be that you require any kind of rental assistance, to provide any kind of assistance to owner, that you would only provide that to registered owners. You can send carefully crafted mailers to landlords. There's some good kind of behavioral studies, research suggesting that different kinds of language is more effective in getting landlords to comply. You can create a citizen reporting system. You can make these systems publicly accessible. And if you're living in a rental property and you look up your building and you see it's not registered, well, you can report to the city and identify your building as a rental property. And you can also kind of link in other kinds of administrative data that the city has access to that collects, like various kinds of whatever code enforcement data, et cetera, to identify properties that are likely to be rental in order to identify rental properties and to target outreach to encourage them to register. So I think that's it, right? That is it. So I think we can move right on to the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Ingrid. That was great. And so, Allison, I'm excited to talk with you. The City of Oakland's registry is relatively new. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the timeline has been and where things stand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say thanks for having me. So basically, it's brand new. Essentially, this Oakland City Council approved the rent registry ordinance in June of 2022, and the Oakland Rent Adjustment Program launched the program to go into effect for the first time by July 3rd of 2023. So the way the timeline worked was that we reached out to property owners in May of 2023 to give them 2 months to advise them of that requirement to register by that July 1st deadline. And at this point, and then owners have to re-register, either re-up, either confirm their information has not changed, or report changes in tenancy information annually. They'll need to report that again by July 1st of 2024, and then annually thereafter by March 1st. So that's kind of where we're at in this moment.
Gotcha. Really brand new.
Really
that's
brand new.
great.
Just went into effect on I think July 3rd, actually. I think July 1st was a Saturday. So July 3rd.
So all this will be very fresh in your mind. And you saw Ingrid talk about kind of the different reasons that cities might create a registry.
Yep.
Can you talk about Oakland's motivation? What does it hope to accomplish?
So Oakland's motivation was definitely related to its two ordinances. One is the rent adjustment ordinance, which regulates rents in the city of Oakland for units that are covered by that ordinance, and then also to register units that are covered by the just cause for eviction ordinance, which covers an even wider group of units. So owners have to register either if their unit's covered by either the just cause for eviction ordinance or the rent adjustment ordinance, they do need to register their units. So the goal was definitely around better enforcing those two ordinances.
Gotcha. And so how were those ordinances enforced before the registry?
So prior to the registry, I would say that Oakland had what we would call a more passive enforcement, more of a complaint-based system. The rent ordinance went into effect, I believe, in 1983, and it covers multifamily properties built prior to that date. And so basically, if an owner or if a tenant received a rent increase and they were not sure if it was compliant with the rent ordinance, they need to contact the Rent Adjustment Program, or RAP. That's sort of our shorthand for the name of our agency. They need to contact RAP, and they could file a petition to contest that rent increase. So that's more of a complaint-based system, right? And so with the establishment of a rent registry, the ultimate goal is to provide a little more of an active enforcement of the ordinance by requiring that rents be reported. Ultimately, the goal is that that information can be communicated so that both tenants and owners are aware of the rents that have been reported and the most recent rent increase, and give them kind of an access point to that information, which will give them more opportunities to contact RAP, find out a little more about the rent regulation ordinance, and go from there.
So how do you reach the tenants? How do you provide that information to tenants?
So remember, we just launched.
I know, got it. I know. What's the goal?
Yeah, the goal is to be able to sort of reach out to tenants and let them know what's been reported, so that they just know. And then the goal is also to provide, at this time, the rent registry is not sort of publicly searchable, just because we're not quite there yet. We're still catching up on a lot of data entry, trying to literally get rents into the system, which is kind of this heroic effort by RAP staff. So the goal is to ultimately provide some more publicly available database as well, where tenants can access registered information.
And so I'd love to talk a little bit about the structure of the registry. What kinds of information are you collecting?
So there's certain information regarding ownership, and then there's certain information regarding individual tenancies. So owners are required to provide the name of the owner and percentage ownership. And I had heard you referencing earlier sort of other registries' efforts to maybe find out if there was if it's an LLC, like getting behind that. The Oakland Rent Registry only requires that the owner be reported. So if the owner is an LLC, that's the information that is required to be reported. So so ownership information and contact information for the owner. And if that's a property management company, if that's the contact that we should be reaching out to, the name of the property manager. And then also there's specific unit information that needs to be provided for each covered unit. And that is the rent that was first charged when the tenancy started, the current rent, the date of the most recent rent increase and the amount, the number of occupants, the security deposit, services included with the rent, and the names of the tenants who are in the unit. And I think, and also the reason for the previous, and the reason why the previous tenant vacated, like if they were evicted for cause, if they were evicted for a no-fault eviction, if they voluntarily vacated, because that affects the next rent that can be charged.
That's great. That's great. And then who maintains the registry and kind of what goes into that?
When you say who maintains, so RAP as an agency maintains the registry, and our staff communicates with owners regularly about, how to register their units, if they want to make updates. And then also, of course, for owners who didn't we have an online rent registry. Owners can register online, but of course they can submit registration forms to submit that data, and then the staff enters that data. So if there's questions about that process, and then of course the actual entry of data. So that is RAP, though. It's the rent adjustment program that's maintaining the rent registry.
Yeah. And then lastly, what happens if you don't register? What's the penalty?
So there's sort of two groups of folks who need to register. There's those units that are covered by the rent ordinance, and then there's those units that are covered by just cause. So if your unit's covered by the rent ordinance, an owner cannot file a petition to increase rent. They can't answer a tenant's petition. And if they don't register and they serve the tenant a notice of rent increase, the tenant has grounds to contest that rent increase for not having registered. And that requirement to register has been incorporated into, the RAP petition process, right? And then if the unit's covered by the just cause for eviction ordinance, failure to register has been established as an affirmative defense in most eviction actions. So if a tenant, if an owner files an eviction notice, and they haven't registered the unit, it's an affirmative defense.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. I was interested to see some registries kind of require that you register in order to receive rental assistance or to evict, which I think is, goes beyond a fine and is noteworthy. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about, the environment in which this registry was created? Was there any pushback or concerns?
So, yeah, I mean, basically, Oakland had been kind of transitioning from a kind of that more complaint-based system to a more active system of enforcing the rent adjustment ordinance and the just cause for eviction ordinance. The changing economics of the area were related to housing costs and displacement were having their effect, right? And then there was also a related, there were some increases in homelessness. So there was sort of and these combination of factors sort of, kind of drove an effort to strengthen some of the elements of the rent regulation ordinance and the just cause for eviction ordinance. So over time, there were some changes kind of being made to the ordinance. Some exemptions from the ordinance. There were some legislative changes. The city council voted to reduce some of the exemptions from the ordinance. And then also internally in the rent adjustment program, some efforts were made to strengthen some of the services that were being provided, increase our presence for outreach, increase our ability to communicate with owners, and we call it housing counseling. So increase our housing counseling presence and services. So there was a sort of like, this kind of trend over the last several years to kind of move toward a little more of an active enforcement model. And then the ordinance was passed in 2022 by the city council. And there was some concern by property owners for a couple reasons. I heard some of those concerns addressed in the presentation. The administrative burden, was a concern. There was concern around privacy, specifically tenant privacy, because the rent adjustment, because the registry requirement does provide the provision of tenants' names. So, it's very important for us to emphasize that tenants' names are kept private. They're not provided.
So that won't be part of the publicly available.
No,
right. Okay, good.
No, and wouldn't be provided as like a PRA, if information is requested, tenant data would not be provided as part of that. So that's been an important element to emphasize. So yeah, there was some concern about that, and so we've been really cognizant of that. That's been a concern on our end as well.
Great. Well, I am seeing tons of great questions.
I know there are tons of questions, actually.
So I don't want to hog it too much. Please
is,
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in on one which picks up exactly where you were, Allison. There are a couple of questions about privacy, but more from the standpoint of the owner. So I'm wondering if that came up. And
I mean, a little bit. The ownership information does have to be provided, and contact information. A lot of that's public record to begin with. We used to reach out to owners initially. RAP use county data,
Mhm.
which is public record, to reach out
Yep.
to owners. So
Yep.
that's information that, and I'll, I guess I should emphasize as well that in any publicly available portal, the owner's information wouldn't be provided either. I guess I should say no individual's names would be provided in any kind of public facing portal. And again, that we're not even there yet, right?
Okay.
So, but yeah, that's obviously something to be concerned about. But yeah, that would not be provided in a, like I said, in a public facing portal. I lost my thread of my thread there.
That's okay. I have another question for you. I'm wondering if, in the future, Oakland might plan to use these information in other ways too, beyond just enforcing the two laws you mentioned. Are there any thoughts about, the data collection aspects and, tracking forms of ownership, that sort of thing?
That's definitely, I'm not sure about that. I mean, for us, for the first year, our biggest goal is engagement, right? To engage as many owners as possible in this process, to register as many units as possible. So we have as complete a data set as possible. And kind of getting to one point Ingrid made earlier, one of the goals was that data was another interest for the city of Oakland, because the city doesn't have any or wasn't collecting in any granular way rent data, right? That's one of the most important advantages I think that a rent registry offers, is it requires, individual reporting of individual units rents. So that is, like I said, one of our just primary goals right now, is to just get as much information as we possibly can. As far as future goals, I feel like those are kind of a little more policy questions, whether to relate the rent registry to proactive inspection or anything like that. I do feel like that's a little more of a policy goal that I'm not really able to speak to at this time.
Sure.
But they're real. Yeah, that's real stuff.
So I see a question here that might be more for you, Ingrid. The anonymous attendee says that I live in a red state that's not so kind to renters, and we do have a state law that actually prohibits registries. So we have certain counties that have created certification and inspection programs, but the city I live in states that an inspection program would not work due to the size of the city. What are your suggestions for working around these laws?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what, and we're happy, by the way, I should say this up front, you should follow up with us if we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions, or if we don't answer them fully. But I think that it is possible that, I mean, like Allison is talking about, not actually releasing, right, owners' names and owners' information. There may be information that you could collect about rental properties that would not violate the state ordinance. So we would have to look specifically at the ordinance, and we could certainly follow up. But I think that's going to be sort of a state specific question. But I think there's a lot of range in the amount of information that is both collected and also then made publicly available through these ordinances. And I think there are sort of lighter touch ordinances that still could go a long way to help a city kind of track, which properties are rental and potentially what the rents are. But maybe that one is, again, just even knowing the rental properties and sort of taking some baby steps to sort of build the infrastructure, I think could still really be very useful and probably consistent with the statute.
Right. And I know you mentioned also the need for federal leadership on registries. And
right.
also, I think, just advocating at the state level for change.
That's right. This is, and you think about this. I mean, I don't mean to be, I don't mean at all to be dismissing the sort of privacy concerns, but you think about how much information is out there about housing transactions, and when you buy and you sell a property. And it just seems like we're so, then we have nothing about rental transactions. And I think there's some, I think it's fair to move that needle a little bit towards providing a little bit of information. I mean, I just think that cities are having to sort of craft policies without any information about rental properties.
And again, that was one of the goals, was to have information for Oakland specifically, was to inform future policy decisions, because that granular information wasn't available.
So Chris Norman, who I know is from Oakland, asks if we know of any city that collects renters' AMI or renter or property owner race and ethnicity data. That's a great question. I will say our scan of 46 registries is far from exhaustive, but we did not find a single registry that does either of those things. So I would be surprised, but very, very, very interested. Curious if that does exist. Let's see. Dustin asks, and this may be too early for you, Allison, but what compliance has been like, and what have been the barriers to comply?
So we reached out initially to register, and again, using county data, because we wanted to cast a pretty wide net. Because this was a brand new ordinance, we wanted to inform as many people as possible, maybe people who didn't have any idea that the rent adjustment program existed at all. So we reached out to the owners of about 48,000 properties, comprising, I want to say, 110,000 units, and knowing that a lot of those properties wouldn't even be rental properties, we just wanted to reach out to those owners. And it's estimated that the number of units covered by the rent adjustment ordinance and just cause eviction ordinance are probably in the neighborhood of 95,000 units. So we have registered at this time close to 54,000. And of those, I believe about 45,000 are tenant occupied. So we have rent data for about 45,000 units. And another, I want to say 3,000 are reported as vacant, or unavailable. So there's no rent data to report. So, yeah, about 57,000, I would say, rental units have been reported. So I haven't done the compliance math in my head today, but, we're getting to over 50% of, of units that we believe are covered by, one or both of these two ordinances. And that's after, about 6 months of having had this in effect. So
do you have a sense that are you able to look at all at sort of whether these are smaller properties or?
Yeah, so the way the rent registry works is like, I mean, the total number of buildings is listed. I don't have that data right in front of me. Definitely the types of I'd say the multifamily, owners are, they're often managed by property management companies. So, and then of course the Bay Area has multiple rent ordinances and registries in effect. So if you're managing a property in Oakland, you might already be registering properties in Berkeley or San Francisco as well. So, the process is kind of something that they can, so probably definitely more multifamily owners, but I don't have any, numbers to provide in this moment. But yeah, we're able to look at that for sure.
I see a few questions here about short-term rentals. I will say that could be the subject for a whole nother data talk, and we've done a separate scan on short-term rental registries, so we could definitely plan to share data from that in a future episode. So thanks for those questions. But Allison, really quickly, for Oakland, are you guys tracking short-term rentals?
So for that's pretty separate from the rent registry, because short-term rentals are specifically exempted. Any rental of less than 30 days is not covered by the rent adjustment ordinance or just cause. So those are kind of exempt from the rent registration requirement because they're not covered by those ordinances.
Sure.
So yeah, they're kind of a little
bit. It's a whole nother.
Yeah, like you said, it might be a whole nother talk. Yeah.
Great. And how do you fund, the staff and the time needed to maintain the registry? Where does that budget come from?
So the rent adjustment, it's called the RAP fee. So basically owners of a unit that's covered by either one of these ordinances pays a fee to the rent adjustment program. It's $101 per unit due annually. And owners can pass 50% of that fee on to tenants in Oakland, provided that they paid it on time, and they pass it on to the tenant within the same calendar year. So yeah, half of that fee can be passed on to the tenant.
But so the revenue from the fees is kind of
Yes.
sufficient to cover the operation. Cool.
Yeah,
And
that's-
Bithia asks relatedly, did you guys have to hire any additional staff to run it?
We've had definitely some temporary staff, especially in this first year. The first year of the launch of a rent registry, and we, our database developer, the company that was hired to, build it for us, definitely confirmed this with their experience of other cities. The first year is the most labor intensive because you are putting information into the system for the very first time. After that, it can be updated. Like I said before, Oakland had no granular unit data. So we literally were telling owners, let us know what units you have. What are they called? A, B, C, put them in there. And if they didn't want to do that online, then they could submit forms, and then staff does that. So for the first time, you're putting all that information in the system. It's very labor intensive. As time goes on, it becomes a little more, you're just updating, right? So yes, we have hired temporary staff to assist with that, that kind of burden, that administrative burden that we're focusing on for this, especially like I said, in this first year.
I can imagine. I remember in a previous conversation, we were chatting about, a stack of PDF documents that you guys have to go through.
And then of course, just for the initial rent registry, we did, the Oakland did have to budget additional positions. So, that effort did require the budgeting of additional positions in RAP.
Great. Again, this may be too soon to ask, but Krista Lenson asks whether Oakland has seen any trends regarding rent increases or even landlords selling properties since the registry has been implemented.
I think it's hard for us to know on our end. As time goes on, people will let us know. If we'll be reaching out to them manually, letting them know they need to register. They'll let us know if they've sold a property or not. I can't really speak to that in any large way. I just can't. Yeah.
Sure. And yeah, Krista, we can follow up too. There's been some, I would say, limited research on the effect of registries on rental supply and rental costs. So there are some studies out there that might be useful. Let's see. Max asks about whether Oakland will share any of these data with researchers.
So information can be requested from the rent registry through PRA, and we are able to share data that's publicly available. So if people make that request, we are sharing. Yeah, we will share that data.
Great. Cool. Just going through. My goodness, there is a lot of interest in this subject.
Really?
Right.
That's great.
Yes. Rosalind says, in Missouri, any change in occupancy of a property requires an inspection and the name of the new occupant. Have you found other communities that require the same? Yes. We have seen some registries that are kind of tied to changes in tenancy or even point of sale, things like that. But like Ingrid mentioned, most of them require just annual registration.
I will just add to that, in Oakland, it's annual registration. But if there has been a change in the occupancy, they need to report that at that time.
Again, so, right. So that also triggers a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
And then that kicks off another annual, right, cycle for the new owner.
Well, when I say change in occupancy, if a new tenant has moved, so let's say you're registering for you already registered July 23rd, you're registering again for July 24th. If a new tenant has moved in since last year, you need to report that new tenant at that time.
Oh, okay.
And new rent increase, and any rent increase as well.
Aubrey wants to know whether we have any thoughts about using the registry as a starting point for implementing a vacancy tax. Interesting. Yeah, we could look into that. I'm sure it would be an important foundation for doing that. And then we have a question from Sarah, which is focused on New York. Great. Does New York City have a rental registry, and which agency oversees or manages it? Do you happen to know, Ingrid?
Yeah, I mean, HPD has a rental registry, but it's basically it's sort of for multifamily properties that are not owner occupied. So
Gotcha.
Well, actually, no, it's for properties that are not owner occupied. So.
Well, great. So
Great.
tons of great questions. We are definitely not going to get to all of them. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time. We'd love to engage with you about this. And we'll close out with just one more question for you, Allison. What advice would you give to other cities interested in setting up a rental registry?
You want to give a lot of thought to your inventory of who you're reaching out to initially, because that's really important, right? Who you engage in the process. And then also, again, we used county data. And it had its costs and benefits, right? So it's really important to think about what group of folks you're reaching out to initially and how, because that kind of sets the tone for everything that happens later. And then outreach is super important, right? To be really aware that you need to let people know in multiple ways. You need to have folks in the agency who are really able to communicate all these changes. So outreach just is, and just have plans for that, right? Plans for continued outreach, various methods. Oakland's a really diverse city, so we've had to think about ways of reaching different communities. Our non-English speaking communities, really important to consider. So just that ongoing outreach piece is really important as well.
That's great. Well, thank you, Allison. Thank you, Ingrid. Thanks to everyone. We hope to see you in March for our next episode. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.